Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 16, Section 3, The Other Side of Life. So, as we go along, make sure you fill in the information that you need. Number one, about 30 million Americans, kind of starting in the 1950s, lived below the poverty line. In the in the era of post-war America, uh, there really was a huge discrepancy between those who were the haves and have-nots. And really, during the early 50s, we had a huge expansion of the middle class, but it didn't necessarily impact all peoples. And by 1962, a man named Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America. And he really focused in on some different groups that were really targeted by being left out, focusing on some of our minorities and some geographic areas that had been kind of left behind as the middle class kind of blossomed. So, at number two, single mothers, elderly, minorities, immigrants, blacks, Native Americans, and white rural Americans all made up this group of our 30 million that were living below the poverty lines in the 1950s. And if you would take a look at the line graph that we have here, you can kind of see poverty rates by race from 1959 all the way through 2004. If you take a look at our African American population, as time goes on, the gap kind of narrows. But if you're looking at, you know, Hispanic Americans, and then like really all other groups combined, there's kind of a steady number, and that's something that really we've always been kind of having to deal with since the end of World War II. Number three, the middle class families, those who uh, felt like it, left many of the inner cities and they moved to the suburbs. And as a result, we had kind of the beginnings of um, kind of urban decay. And by the time we get kind of in the late 50s, early 1960s, there's a push for urban renewal. And in our inner cities, there were a lot of poor people that were living because rents were low. Um, some cases that they were close enough to work that they wouldn't have to use transportation systems, they could walk. But when the 60s rolls around, there's a push to get rid of those inner areas dwelling places and to build new sky rises and new parking garages and things of that nature. And as a result, there is concern about where are we going to put the poor people. And there are some cities that toy with public housing, and in some cases they build it. And in the time period from the 1960s to the present day, some of those public housings have been razed. In other words, they have been destroyed because what they found is that they don't really work. What you're doing is you're still kind of concentrating the poor people in one geographic area and not necessarily helping those people to rise out of that. Number four, African Americans experienced racial discrimination when it came to schools and housing and hiring and salaries in a lot of northern cities after they migrated out of the South. They were also deprived of decent medical care as well. During the times of really World War I and World War II, we had this movement known as the Great Migration, where a lot of African Americans who had been living in the Deep South, maybe working as sharecroppers and such, they moved north to the big factories to find work. And cities like Chicago and Detroit grew very large as far as the new population that was coming northward. But by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, some of the same problems that African Americans had faced in the South have followed them north. Number five, during the 1950s, the government tried to integrate Native Americans into the mainstream society with something known as determination policy. Determination policy, the goal of that, for the most part, was to um, really bring Native Americans kind of into kind of the mainstream by eliminating the whole notion of tribal society. And the goal would have been to eliminate the legal entities that a lot of the tribal groups had, like their territory and such, and move Native Americans off reservations, close the reservations, and then eventually relocate them into urban areas. What we found is that, like a lot of other groups who were kind of forced out of their territory and into urban areas, that there was a lot of poverty. And eventually, this policy dies out because it didn't work. And today, we still have the legal entities of tribes. If you take a look at the map here on the screen, you can kind of see some of the different areas. We have a couple reservations here in Nebraska, and then you look into the Dakotas and Oklahoma and New Mexico and Arizona, to name a few. These tribes and their reservations still exist. Number 6, before the 1950s, coal mining, especially in Appalachia, had formed the background of their economy. In the 1950s, things start changing, and coal mining becomes more mechanized. And as a result, about 1.5 million Appalachians, they leave states like Tennessee and Kentucky and West Virginia, looking for other opportunities. And in a sense, it really kind of decimates the incomes and the livelihoods for a lot of these folks. This is an area, even today, that is still riddled with extreme poverty in the United States. Number 7, as a result of the launch of Sputnik in 1957, America's worried about the education of their children here in the United States. In the 1950s, there was a lot of concern about, teenagers in general, that maybe they had been coddled or for the most part pampered by their parents, and they weren't as hardworking as maybe previous generations of teenagers. There was a kind of a rise in juvenile delinquency and such, and there was a push to get the Department of Education to really go about and up the standards for students so that they could compete with the Soviet Union. So one of the things that we start doing in an effort to improve the educational system in the United States was to put on technical education in the form of advanced subjects like math and science. So an example would be like if you had graduated maybe from high school in the 1950s, maybe the highest level of math at that period of time might have been algebra or algebra 2. Possibly geometry might have been pushing the limits. And by the time we get out of the late 50s and move into the 60s and 70s, there's a push to bring on the advanced maths, pushing for trigonometry and calculus. When you talk about science, pushing things like chemistry and physics, so that students have an exposure to that and maybe might gravitate into those kind of occupations. Thank you very much.